Later in the day, Fate walks down the path leading to the house and sees a girl walking towards him with a huge battle axe hoisted on her shoulder. He hasn't seen the girl around there before. As they walk beside each other, the girl calls out to him. When Fate looks at her eyes, they look just like his when he activates his skill. He tries to analyze her but can't get anything. She calls out to him again and he asks her what she wants. She tells him she came too early. Fate asks her what she means. She tells him she came for the kobolds but he can have them. She tells him he owes her one when they meet in the future. As she walks away, Fate asks Greed if he knows who she was. Greed tells him he has no idea who she is. At that point, Roxy meets up with Fate. She looks back at the strange girl, telling Fate she's a Galian. She goes into a history lesson. She tells him 4,000 years ago Galia was a strong nation until a surge of monsters caused its collapse by eliminating all its citizens. Fate tells her apparently some citizens survived. She tells him she hasn't seen such a full-blooded Galian before. She tells Fate they should both head to the house together. Fate tells her he knows about her monster hunt and asks her if she'll be okay. She tells him she won't be alone because some warriors will accompany her. She also tells him he shouldn't worry since she's a magic knight after all. At night, Fate decides to hunt the kobolds. The crown beast has some kobold warriors guarding it, with several junior kobolds moving with the pack as well. He pulls him out and takes down several junior kobolds. He shoots at the crown beast but it uses one of its warriors to block the shot. The others try to protect the crown beast but Fate takes them down. After taking down all the kobolds and his gluttony skill absorbing their skills, he's not convinced he has enough to take down the crown beast. He shoots at the crown beast, thinking he can bring him down, but it catches both his arrows. Greed tells Fate to get close to it and fight it with his sword form. Fate rushes in without thinking. The crown beast releases a skill which Greed warns Fate about but it's too late. Greed tries to get him back on his feet but he doesn't respond. The crown beast tries to land the finishing blow but it loses its arm in a split second. Fate is back on his feet. Greed praises him for tricking the crown beast into thinking he was knocked out cold. The crown beast launches its skill again but Fate dodges out of the way. But he is hit midair by a kobold warrior. Fate ends the kobold warrior and absorbs his stats with his gluttony skill. At this point, Greed tells him he can use his first level hidden art but he will need 10% of his stats for it. Fate tells him to take it so they can end the crown beast. Greed transforms into a huge special bow. As Fate charges Greed's skill, the crown beast also charges his skill. They both launch their skills at the same time but Greed's skill surpasses that of the crown king. It literally gives him a shortcut to heaven. Greed tells Fate the regeneration skill he got from the Goblin King has already healed him. Back at the house, Roxy is happy the kobolds were taken down and they can return to the capital. Aisha is happy Roxy looks so excited around Fate. Later in the day, Aisha calls Fate to her bedroom and asks him to stay by Roxy's side to support her. Fate doesn't think he's worthy but Aisha tells him he just needs to have a desire to help her. At that point she coughs for a while and Fate rushes to hold her up. She tells him her time is running out, which is why she wants him to look out for Roxy in her place. She begs him and tells him to take his time to think about it. The next day Fate is at the tavern with an eye patch over his right eye. He thinks he's not worthy to stand before Roxy. The door to the tavern opens and the bartender's friend comes in. He tells the bartender Sir Hato is going to join the hunt for corpse. Fate is surprised by this. The bartender tells his friend it's Sir Hato's way of getting some glory from completing an easy task. His friends tell him Sir Hato is better off going for the Galia expedition. The bartender tells him Sir Hato only goes where it's safest for him. Fate is surprised there's another expedition so soon after Sir Mason's death. At the knight's house, several knights are preparing to head off for the expedition, including Roxy and the trio knights. Before leaving, Roxy visits her father's grave and tells him all that's happened, asking him to watch over her. Fate advises her not to go because she might not return. She tells him she has decided to go and walks away. The trio knights are happy they'll be able to get rid of Roxy once and for all. While Hato will be going for the Galia expedition with the hopes of doing away with Roxy, the other two will be going to another city for research. Hato thinks they're hiding something from him and wants in on what they will be going to do. Raphael just tells him to make sure he takes care of Roxy. Later at night, though Fate cannot disobey direct orders or protect Roxy, there is one thing he can do. He stands in the way of Sir Hato and his patrol. Sir Hato comes face to face with him, happy to have found corpse. His henchmen leap forward with their weapons drawn and try to attack Fate. As they close the distance to Fate, he brings down all three henchmen one by one. Hato doesn't look so confident anymore. Fate looks back at him and his henchmen ditch him faster than the speed of light. Even Einstein would be impressed. Hato tries to rally them but his henchmen leave him standing there alone to face Fate. Fate walks up to him and Hato draws his sword. Fate takes off his mask and Hato immediately recognizes him. Fate tells Hato to show him the knight powers he's so proud of. Fate activates his skills and looks at Hato's stats. The holy sword technique catches his eye. It's the special skill needed to become a holy knight. Fate wonders how Hato got such a skill. Hato tells him it will be foolish to face him in a sword fight. Hato activates the skill and strikes at Fate, but Fate is already out of the way. Hado is shocked and Fate lands behind him. He tells him his skill takes way too long to launch. Hado turns around and strikes at Fate with his sword, but Fate simply slices his holy sword into two. Hado looks shocked at half of his sword. Hado backs away from Fate and considers taking to his heels. Fate reads his body language and tells him not to run but to uphold his pride as a holy knight. Hado keeps backing up. Fate tells him he's pathetic. Hado trips and falls and Fate calls him a clown. Fate lifts him up like a ragdoll and reminds him of a statement he made. Defiant dogs need to be taught discipline. Hado begs him to stop but runs to a tree and gives Hado's face a nice makeover. Fate keeps falling trees around the forest with Hado's face until he's unrecognizable. Hado begs him once again to stop. Fate is pissed he has the nerve to beg considering how he treated other people like meaningless trash. Fate is also angry Roxy would be walking into danger because of him. Hado begs him to spare his life and Fate asks him what his response was when he told him the same thing. He throws Hado into the air and activates Greed's skill. Greed turns into a crossbow and Fate fires several shots at Hado while he's still in the air. When Hado finally lands on the ground, his limbs are gone. Hado asks him why he won't finish him off and begs him to end his sorrow. Fate tells him he has a question for him first. Hado asks him if it's about Roxy. He recalls her volunteering for the Galia expedition and how she vowed to give her life to save the people. Fate confirms that Roxy would indeed say those words. Hado promises to cancel Roxy's Galia expedition if Fate spares his life. Fate raises Greed over Hado's chest. Hado begs him not to do anything stupid like getting revenge for Roxy. Fate tells him to shut his mouth and gives Greed a taste of Hado's innards. His skill activates and his stats increase. Fate now gains the Holy Knight technique. Greed tells him he has now become a Holy Knight. Greed tells him he can use Hado's stats to access his second level. Fate gives him the go-ahead and Greed takes up his stats. He transforms into his second level, which is a great scythe. Greed tells Fate his blade can now cut through anything in the universe. The next day, Roxy prepares to leave. The servants stand around her to see her off, but they don't look too happy. She tells them not to look so gloomy because 3 years will pass by in a flash. She tells Haru to look after things in her absence. She comes face to face with Fate and they stare at each other for a while. She assures him they will meet again. Fate tells her to take care of herself and she leaves. Later, Haru gives Fate a letter of recommendation Roxy left for him. Roxy recommended him to a lord's manor to keep him safe. However, Fate rejects it and tells Haru he will make a way for himself as a warrior. Fate packs his belongings. Greed asks him if he has made up his mind. He tells Greed if he can't stop Roxy from traveling, the least he can do is to support her. Fate bids farewell to the other servants and Haru hands him his pay for the work he has done. She wishes him good luck and he leaves. He enters a carriage, hoping that he's strong enough to protect Roxy. At the laboratory, the female scientist asks Rain for her attention. She asks her if she knows about the lick everyone in town is talking about. She shows Rain the slain goblins and observes the arrow marks aren't normal arrow marks. Rain takes a close look and is fascinated by it. She opens up a book and shows the female scientist a magic bow. She tells her she thinks that the arrow from that magic bow did it. The female scientist asks her if magic arrows are different from fireballs. Ryan tells her it's an ability possessed by the Black Sword, one of the weapons of mortal sin. Weapons of mortal sin are made from special materials that can manipulate magic at a high level. Those weapons can control magic power, and Rain thinks they can increase the skills of whoever wields them. Meanwhile, Fate is resting in the public carriage and wakes up when they arrive in the town of Tetra. He is nostalgic because the city has hardly changed. Greed asks him if he's been to the city before and he tells him he was here 5 years ago. He tells Greed he passed through the town on his way to the capital. Fate approaches a carriage driver and asks him if he is heading to Galia. The driver tells him his carriage won't be going today because they could be attacked by monsters at night. He tells him to come back tomorrow. Fate walks away quickly. At the local pub, Set is asking several warriors to help save his village. They brush away his money, telling him it's not to get them to hunt monsters. They start bullying Set and Fate comes to his rescue. He easily overpowers the bully and pushes him to the ground. The other warriors try to fight Fate, but he overpowers them. They run away from the pub. The man tries to thank Fate but cuts him off, telling him he hasn't seen him in a long time. In the past, Fate was bullied by Set and his friends who called him a good-for-nothing. Fate's father was a warrior who used to fight against monsters. Fate would always make herbs for his father because he was always injured. His father was impressed that Fate was so good at making herbal mixtures. After Fate's dad passed away, the villagers wondered who would look after him now that his dad is gone. Fate was exiled because the village chief thought he was useless. The villagers chased him away from the village, calling him a good-for-nothing. Back to the present, Set knelt before Fate, begging for his help. Fate remembers Set, who is the son of the village chief who exiled him. Set tells him he knows his request is selfish, but he tells him he needs a warrior's strength. Greed tells him it's a good opportunity to satiate his skill, gluttony. Set leads him back to the village, but the village chief who is Set's dad isn't happy to see Set return with Fate. Set takes Fate to his house and offers him a beverage. Set apologizes for the way the chief behaved and Fate tells him he's used to it. Fate asks Set to tell him about the monsters. Set tells him the monsters showed up about a month ago and witnesses think they are multiple monsters that can fly. He tells Fate these monsters are unlike anything the village has ever seen before. That's why they decided to hire some warriors. Just then Fate's stomach growls. Set teases him about always being hungry and goes to get Fate something to eat. Fate asks Greed if he knows the kind of monsters attacking the village. Greed tells him the monsters are most likely gargoyles. He tells Fate they are smart monsters who use probe attacks to see how humans react before the full pack attacks together. Set's daughter walks up to Fate and asks him who he's talking to. Fate tells her he's talking to himself. She gives him a piece of candy. Set comes back with some food, apologizing for how small it is. Fate tells him it's more than enough and thanks him for the meal. Fate takes a bite from the food and immediately becomes very tired. He passes out right after. Set wonders what made him pass out and Set's daughter tells him she gave him some candy. Set asks her about it and she tells him Set's dad gave it to her. Set tries to wake him up but then a scream pierces through the night. Set looks out the window and he's shocked at the sight before him. The gargoyles are attacking the village. Set makes the antidote for Fate. Meanwhile, the village is glowing a bright orange in the dark night. The village chief is running down the street looking for Fate so he can be used as bait. The gargoyle picks him up and knows dinner is settled for the night. Set gives Fate the antidote and he wakes up. Flames flare outside Set's house which jolts Fate into action. He picks up Greed and heads outside. Fate tries to find survivors but the sight of the village weakens his spirits. The gargoyles are still busy having dinner and Fate comes face to face with one. The gargoyle launches a breath of flame at Fate who dodges it. Greed tells him he can't match the gargoyles if they have the high ground. Fate listens to him, unlike a certain Jedi we know. Fate analyzes the skills of the gargoyles and looks over their stats. Fate thinks its fireball skill is troublesome and orders Greed to transform into a scythe. The gargoyle launches a fireball at Fate once again. Instead of dodging it, he cuts through it. The gargoyles notice that Fate is putting up a fight and they all surround him. They launch their fireballs at him simultaneously. Fate uses the scythe which cuts through the fireball and then cuts through the gargoyles one after the other. Fate's gluttony skill activates, his stats increase, and he gets the fireball magic skill. Fate notices there is still one gargoyle left. This is the pack leader. Fate analyzes the leader and notices he has a higher level than normal gargoyles and an additional skill of fire resistance. The leader lunges at Fate to use a fireball at point blank range, but Greed warns Fate about it and tells him to take advantage of that. Fate immediately lunges at the diving leader. Fate strikes the leader down with the scythe and his gluttony skill activates. Fate's stats increase once again, and he gets the skill of fire resistance. The next day, Fate and Set stand over what's left of the village. Only Set and a few other villagers survive the attack. Fate returns to his old family house and goes to the grave site of his parents. The site brings back memories of his childhood and he tells his father he's doing good now. Fate then takes the ride from the carriage driver. The carriage driver asks him if he will be able to protect him if he's so sleepy. Fate apologizes to him. The driver tells Fate he's paying him for his services, so he better ensure his safety. Suddenly, the man brings the carriage to a halt. Bandits stand in front of the carriage. The leader of the bandits rallies his men to attack him and Fate. At that moment, a huge sword falls from the sky behind the group of bandits, breaking their formation and knocking them to the ground. Greed tells Fate there's only one person who can do that. Fate looks up to see the girl he saw some days back. She then tells Fate he owns her for those kobolds. Fate doesn't understand what she means. She asks to join them, but when she gets on the carriage it tilts backward. The girl yells her weapon, Sloth, to go back to normal, and the carriage rights itself. The girl asks Fate what his name is. Fate introduces himself to her and she calls him Fate of Gluttony. Fate asks her how she knows about gluttony, and she replies she's also a deadly sin skill owner. Fate asks her about the deadly sin skill and she asks him if Greed didn't tell him about it. The girl introduces herself as mine with the skill of wrath. Her stomach rumbles and Fate gives her some beef jerky. The driver tells them they are about to arrive in the city. The driver tells them Lord Rudolph is preparing a welcome party for the expedition of Galia's army. Fate asks the driver if it's Lady Roxy's expedition and the driver tells him they would be arriving at the town soon. The driver thanks Fate and walks away. Fate asks Greed what they should do, and Greed tells him they should go to an inn. Mine falls asleep while standing and she rests on Fate for support. Fate drops Mine on a bed in a room he got at an inn. Greed tells Fate he had no idea Mine was still alive. Fate asks him how he knows Mine and he says he was in a bad relationship with her and Sloth in the past. Greed tells Fate Sloth is a deadly sin weapon just like him. Fate asks him about deadly sin skills and Greed tells him about the 7 deadly sin skills which violate God's principles. He tells Fate Gluttony is the most sinful skill because it can break through the concept of levels. Fate asks Greed if his punishment is his insatiable hunger and Greed tells him they all have their individual punishments. Fate tells Greed he's quite unlucky, going from people laughing at him for being powerless to having to constantly feed his skill to survive. Greed tells him he can't hesitate if he wants to survive, or he'll be consumed by gluttony. Greed tells him to resist and maintain a half-starvation mode. Fate puts on his mask and gets out to hunt. Fate comes across a sandman and he turns Greed into a bow. Greed tells him to cache his new fire skill before shooting the arrow, and Fate is impressed with the results. The sand is defeated easily. Fate's skill activates. He sees other sandmen and wants to devour them, but Greed tells him to endure it. At the end, Mine wakes up and she's hungry. She gets something to eat but comes across a poster that says whoever defeats the sand golem will be rewarded. Fate keeps taking down the sandmen one at a time and activating his skill little by little. Greed tells him he's getting used to it, and Fate tells him the feeling isn't very pleasant. Greed tells him it's time for him to satisfy gluttony so he doesn't go berserk. The sand golem appears, and Fate recognizes its smell immediately. A group of soldiers are fighting the sand golem, but they have no chance of defeating it. At that point, Fate hits the golem with a magic arrow to draw its attention. He tells the soldiers he'll take down the golem, but they tell him he's no match for the golem. Greed tells him he's pulling an act of justice again, but Fate tells him he just wants to satiate his hunger. The golem shoots balls of sand, but Fate uses a magic arrow to destroy them. He lunges at the golem and tries to attack it, but the golem blocks it. The golem attacks Fate with wind magic to trap him so he can crush him with rocks. Fate transforms Greed into the scythe and slashes at the golem, which storms the wind magic. The core of the golem leaves its body and buries itself in the sand. Greed tells Fate not to let the core disappear, and Fate turns Greed into a bow and tells him to take some of his stats. Fate gives Greed the order to fire at will, and he does, destroying the core of the sand golem. Fate's skill activates and he obtains the skill of sandstorm magic. Fate thinks the crater created by Greed's arrow is too big, but Greed tells him they had no choice. The next day, Fate returns to the room to see Mine getting dressed. He asks her where she's heading and she tells him she's going to hunt the sand golem. Fate tells her he's taken the sand golem down and she is furious she won't get the bounty. Fate tells her he will give her half of it when he cashes in the bounty. Mine asks him about his mask and he tells her it's his identity as Corpse. Fate comes out of the inn and asks a carriage driver for a ride. While on their way, Fate asks if Mine isn't actually gluttony because she's always hungry, but she simply replies that anger burns lots of calories. Fate then mentions that despite eating a lot, Mine doesn't grow at all, but that only angers her, and she increases the weight of her weapon. In the end, that ends up breaking the carriage wheel and they're forced to make a stop. Fate apologizes for what happened, but he then notices Mine is missing. He notices a village nearby, realizing she must have gone there. He chases her, noticing how peaceful the village is. Greed explains the village is near Galia, which usually has active monsters around. So, he concludes there must be someone strong who protects this village. Fate then asks about the castle near the village. Greed replies it's the Hassan Castle. He continues walking deeper into the village until he notices a guy cleaning up his sword. He decides to ask this guy for the village chief's location, mentioning he would like to stay here for the night. The guy turns around, revealing to be an old man and the village chief. Greed notices the old man is holding a holy sword and concludes he's the one protecting the village. Before deciding if he will let Fate stay, the old man asks him for a duel. Fate tries to check the old man's stats, but he notices the usage of appraisal. The old man gets curious, mentioning that despite Fate being level 1, all his stats are over 2 million. Fate is confused because he never noticed the old man use appraisal. However, the man simply asks if Fate accepts or not. Fate unsheathes his sword and the two engage in a battle. The duel is even, until Fate decides to finish it quickly, but the old man blocks his attack and manages to disarm him. However, simply mentions this is destiny and allows him to stay. Fate is confused, but the old man has a condition. Fate must take some lessons from him, but the old man doesn't mention why. Greed and Fate think this is pretty suspicious. The old man, however, starts mentioning everything Fate is bad at. He doesn't know how to counter appraisal, nor how to use his skills in a proper way. He simply claims that Fate's body isn't still used to his power. Despite being able to beat monsters, he won't be able to beat people who attack him. The old man mentions Fate could learn a lot from him, but Greed still thinks this is pretty suspicious. However, Fate knows how rare it is for a holy knight to teach someone in person. He accepts the deal and introduces himself. The old man introduces himself as Barbados. Mine suddenly appears, and Barbados can tell she's a skilled warrior just by looking at her. Fate is ready for his training, except that it is hand-to-hand combat. Barbados explains this is the best method to control all the stats Fate has. Barbados says that warriors who suddenly get stronger have problems controlling their power. Fate considers him a smart man and gets ready to start. Barbados starts by correcting Fate's posture. He then teaches Fate how to hit and how much force to use. He demonstrates how it's done, surprising Fate with his speed. Barbados mentions it's all about how he controls of his own body. If he cannot control, his movements will be weak and slow. Fate gets motivated with the lesson, and they continue their lesson. Despite all tries, he still cannot land a hit on Barbados. Suddenly, his gluttony starts acting up, making Barbados confused. He asks Fate why has his eye changed color. However, the skill starts taking over Fate's body and attacks Barbados. The old man manages to dodge, impressed that Fate improved in an instant. Barbados tries to be a bit more serious and attacks, but Gluttony makes Fate watch the old man move in slow motion. He manages to avoid the combo attack, impressing Greed as Fate manages to move quickly despite his half-starvation mode. Later, Barbados tells Fate he will teach him how to fight in a real battle tomorrow. Fate agrees, but he suddenly smells some monsters coming from the castle. He wonders if there are monsters inside it. Fate finds a frame with Barbados' family picture. Greed mentions that Barbados' son looks a lot like Fate. He guessed that Barbados had a reason why he became the village chief, and why he wanted to train him. The next day, Barbados gives Fate a stick and tells him to stop his sword. Fate is confused because it will break, but Barbados replies that Fate can do it because he trained with him. Barbados then attacks, forcing Fate to use his half-starvation state to predict the movement of the sword and let it slide along the stick. He manages to do it, making Barbados proud because Fate can now control his stats. Fate thanks him for all the help and they wait for nighttime. During dinner, Fate tells Barbados they will leave the next morning. However, Mine is more interested in eating than thanking the old man. Barbados tells them to enjoy the food, but Mine reveals she cannot feel its taste. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that's the cost for having the Wrath skill. Mine says she doesn't care about it because she has something to do. That reminds Fate of his mission to help Roxy. The old man gets touched by those words and looks to the castle. Fate asks if there's something there, and Barbados decides to explain. 15 years ago, that castle used to be his. He explains that he was away to perform some kingdom's duties when his territory was attacked by a lick. He lost all his family and people, and now, the castle is being ruled by the Lick Lord. He claims that his family is still trapped inside, but that story only triggers the Gluttony skill. Fate steps outside and looks toward the castle. Barbados follows him, saying that if Fate goes to the castle, he will go with him. He explains that he's still stuck in the past, and he wants to break away from it. Mine also appears, mentioning she will stay to protect the village. That's if they pay her 50 gold. The two decide to go in, but the dark castle suddenly lights up. The fountain suddenly starts working. They can hear the voices of people laughing. They quickly get in, and step inside the second floor, where the lick should be. But upon getting there, they see a room filled with maids and Barbados' son. Barbados' wife and maids welcome him back, but he cannot believe what's going on. He calls them by their names and approaches them, asking if they are still alive. They reply that he must be tired and asked if he managed to fulfill his duty. He confirms, and they all smile. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that despite looking alive, everyone inside the room is already dead. He reveals this is an illusion, but Barbados doesn't seem to notice. Barbados' son asks if his dad bought something for him, and the old man tries to take it off from his jacket. His son suddenly tries to stab him and pulls a knife to block it. The son then backs away, mentioning he's been protecting the castle in place of his father for years. The illusion tries to guilt-trip Barbados into focusing on his work when they were attacked. The illusions claim to still be alive, and that Barbados wants to kill them. But Fate tells the old man that he will deal with the illusions. He wants to use Greed's scythe mode to cut through the whole illusion skill, but Greed replies everyone will be also cut with it. That means that everyone's souls will be consumed by gluttony and live forever in suffering. Fate hesitates because doesn't want them to have that destiny. Barbados then asks him to deal with Lick Lord, while he deals with his own family. The old man duels with his son, impressed by how strong he has become. Meanwhile, follows the smell of monsters and finds himself in a hall. He easily finds the lick and uses Greed's bow mode to shoot it. However, the lick is still up and kicking. Fate looks into his stats, all over the 2 million mark. The lick then attacks, but Fate decides to control his power, just as Barbados has taught him. He follows up from a parry and destroys the lick's hands. Power the monster doesn't give up and starts manipulating dead bodies. Fate hears the bodies asking to be saved, but he cannot attack them. He then looks behind and sees the bodies near him. Luckily, Barbados arrives in time and slices their tendons. He then sees the body of his late wife, saying the same thing she did when they last saw each other. He remembers his family asking why he always had to take the most dangerous missions. But Barbados simply replied he was going to quickly deal with it in return. Barbados realizes he wasn't quick enough, but now he must put them to rest. He uses his Grand Cross skill to purify the bodies and defeat the lick, but the monster is still resisting. Fate looks around and sees the sword of Barbados' son. He picks it up, wanting to help the old man, and they cross their swords to activate the same skill. It's a lot more powerful, and the lick is defeated. Barbados retrieves his family's bodies, apologizing for the time it took him to do it. He suddenly sees their ghosts, and his son tells him it's okay because he just saved them. He then gives his son the souvenir he always promised and embraces the two before everyone disappears. The house then returns to complete darkness, and Barbados asks his family to wait for him. They step outside, and Barbados suddenly reveals that he has broken his level limit. He thinks it's because he was fighting with Fate. Greed confirms, mentioning that can only happen to people who open their hearts to deadly sin skill users. The two only return in the morning, which annoyed Mine, because she was up all night to protect the village. Barbados simply pulls a bag of gold coins and gives it to her. She takes it, but Fate thinks she's greedy. Mine replies she needs gold to rebuild the village, and gold never lies, which is something he will learn if lives long enough. Fate is confused, but Barbados mentions he has seen Mine before. Turns out he saw her 50 years ago, when monsters appeared in that area. Fate is surprised, but Barbados mentions she still looks the same. But at that time she was already a perfect warrior. Mine thanks him for the compliment, stating that he could reach her level if he trains for 1,000 years. Barbados then asks who she is, but Mine replies that she's a ghost who isn't allowed to die. Barbados then notices that Fate's eye has returned to normal. Fate explains that he has a condition that needs him to kill monsters from time to time. If not, his eyes will become red. Barbados quickly guesses that if he doesn't kill the monsters, he will lose his mind. So, he tells Fate to return to him when he finishes doing what he needs to. He mentions that he has something important to tell him, but cannot do it now. On their way, Fate is still complaining about Mine's ability to be a glutton. Once again, she replies that anger burns lots of calories. She tries to share with him, explaining she doesn't want him to be mad at her. She even treats him like a child, feeding him beef jerky and patting his head. Greed is laughing at this, but Fate notices Mine sitting by his side and then resting her head on his thigh. He asks her what she's doing, but she simply replies that this is the best bed in the carriage, despite being so. She quickly falls asleep, and Fate compares her with a child. He then remembers she said she was a ghost who wasn't allowed to die, and that she has something to do. He asks Greed what Mine is fighting against, but Greed doesn't reply. Fate complains, but Greed simply answers that he will see it if he stays with her. Still, Fate thinks this will become troublesome in the future.